In the run-up to COP27 next week, I am delighted to welcome you to this roundtable discussion on the crucial topic of how fire safety interfaces with design for climate emergency. The tragedy of Grenfell has stifled innovation just at the moment when we need it most to meet the climate challenge. I had a pre-meeting earlier this week with several of our participants, and what struck me is how different practices working on different building types at different scales are facing many of the same issues. I hope you will enjoy this roundtable format. It's a chance to learn from your peers, and please put your questions in the chat. We'll endeavor to answer as many as we can in the last 10 minutes or so. We're going to have about 30 minutes of discussion between the panelists now. Then I'd like to conclude the first part of the discussion by identifying 3 or 4 top industry tips. What would really move the dial in this space? And I'll be coming around to each of you for your top tip. Then we'll take questions from our online audience. It's been a really interesting morning with insights from leading practitioners deeply engaged with this topic. We've heard from Paul Hyatt, Jane Duncan, and others. There is a lot of new guidance coming through in the 5 years since Grenfell. And this increased focus on value and quality of construction seems like an ideal opportunity to simultaneously focus on sustainable outcomes to meet our net zero targets. But I haven't heard enough joined up thinking on this yet, and that's what we're going to explore in this session. We also need, as has been pointed out this morning, a cultural change with personal accountability for health and safety and design for climate emergency from all the actors in a project team, including the fire engineer, as was discussed this morning. Both the RIBA and the ARB are tackling this head on by focusing on core competence in these 2 areas. So for this discussion, we're joined by architects from 6 practices who are in the trenches working through these issues, as well as Elaine Toogood from the Concrete Center. I also want to mention that we have freelance journalist Ella Jessel, former AJ News reporter, who has written extensively about the Grenfell inquiry, covering the roundtable today. So look for her write-up in the coming weeks. And finally, an enormous thank you to Rockwool, our headline partner, without whom we would not be having this conversation. So first, let's do a brief round of introductions. Please state your name, where you work, your role, and the types of projects you work on, or any particular experience relevant to this discussion. We're fortunate to have several people with us today with a long track record in sustainable design. So I'm counting on you to put the tough questions forward. And I'll just call on you each in turn the way you're appearing on my screen. So Anna.
Oh, hello, Hattie, hello everyone. I'm Anna Woodison. I'm Director of Projects at Buckley Gray Yeoman. And so it's a practice that works across numerous sectors, but we do large residential and commercial projects, work in education, etc. So this is a particularly, on a number of projects at the moment, we're having significant fire safety challenges and design challenges. And with my particular sustainability hat, I find this particular debate very relevant at the moment.
Okay, Tom, let's keep it short.
Yeah, Tom Jordan, Bar Gazetta's. I'm technical director, Central London retrofit projects, lots of sustainability, fire safety, conflict in the everyday life.
Right, Emily.
Hi, I'm Associate and Architect at Archetype Architects, currently working on a series of large education projects in Scotland, all passive house, all timber frame, and I also sit on our internal fire safety working group.
Fantastic. Elaine. Oh, we don't hear you at all. Try again. I'm going to take Tim while you try to work out your microphone. Tim.
Hi, Tim McCallaghan, Director at Nimtim Architects. We work a lot on small residential domestic projects, as well as some other ones. So I guess our experience is about trying to resolve the fire and sustainability issues within a small team without the support of specialists.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And Roger.
Hi, I'm Roger Holdsworth, technical partner at Pollard Thomas Edwards Architects. We work on many large projects, regeneration projects, particularly a lot of high-rise, high-risk residential buildings.
Jenny, I don't see you, but I know you're there.
Oh, oh no, I was hoping my camera was working today.
Okay, yes, I do see you.
Oh, good. Okay. Jenny Jewett, David Morley Architects. We also work across a number of sectors, a lot of universities and schools as our clients. We're quite well known for sports buildings. We also work in the healthcare sector, and we do resi and student housing. So.
Fantastic. Okay, I'm going to start with kind of our top line question and just pitch in whoever wants to come forward. So what are the top considerations you're facing in balancing fire safety with net zero? Put your hand up if you'd like to say something. Can be your actual hand. Come on, somebody. Okay.
Shall I start?
Roger.
Happy to. I mean,
Yeah.
I think the obvious thing is information. You know, when we're talking about fire risk and safe products, you absolutely need the information in front of you to be able to specify properly. I think a lot of the speakers this morning said very similar things. You know, lack of information, lack of coordination, lack of evidence. I think the two speakers from the Fire Protection Association said, do not rely on the BBAs. And I think that's quite enlightening, isn't it? That that's exactly what we go to try and get the evidence of performance and how appropriate a product is. So that's a big issue for us.
Emily, what are some of the challenges you face?
Yeah, I'd agree with that. I think there's some really big questions and issues for the industry at the moment, and we're finding the more you dig, the more kind of shocking and scary it is. I think one of the key issues is at the moment the approach being taken is that of fire certification for full build-ups. So certs to make sure that external walls, floors, partitions are certified in the exact scenarios that you're proposing, exact product loadings, heights. But that's flawed in many ways that I won't go into. But you know, we find even simple material manufacturers, the big players, are relying on out-of-date tests because of the sheer cost of redoing furnace tests. And it seems, you know, we can't expect designers to be picking up that cost, particularly smaller practices. But equally, it seems really sad to be restricting designers to only pre-certified systems. That's not going to drive kind of site-specific solutions, learning between projects. There's big issues
Elaine,
there.
can I come back to you? Are you online now? Can you introduce yourself, and would you like to? Elaine, are you there? Elaine? Okay.
Wow.
Poor Elaine. I'll take one more on this topic. Tom or Jenny?
Yeah, I'll jump in. So, I mean, one of the big things that we're finding is in a retrofit project, there's so many site-specific details, and trying to get all of these standard tested solutions to work, you need engaged fire engineers, and there are a distinct lack of fire engineers. I think they're all rushed off their feet with the amount of work they've got. So trying to get that done in a timely manner while things are happening and things are being discovered on these quite complex existing buildings, conditions you don't know until you open them up, is a challenge in itself, I think.
Well, we're going to come back to that and talk about that in more detail. Roger, I'm going to come back to you, and because PTE works on so many large-scale housing projects that are higher, 18 meters and up, and you're sort of in the crosshairs of the post-Grenfell focus on fire safety, and light gauge steel and plasterboard is a default approach. So 2 questions for you. What is the appropriate height limit for use of combustible materials? That's the first one.
Well, it depends if you want to meet the regulations or you take a more like a personal approach to how appropriate you think it is. Maybe ask the question, you know, if you lived there, would you feel safe? It's quite a difficult question to answer because I think we have the regulations and clearly that is what we have to follow. We follow the regulations, so we comply and we can say this is a safe building. I think it's quite dangerous actually sometimes to deviate from the regulations because you could be creating unintended consequences. You might make a decision which isn't prescriptive in the regulations and it might have some effects that you hadn't thought about. So we've got to be very careful about how we do progress. So
upping the game in fire safety is also an opportunity to address sustainability. And do you see that happening in the projects you're working on, or is it really business as usual?
Yeah. I mean, occasionally, I think the kind of projects that we work on, sustainability is usually tackled in other ways. You know, it's the thermal performance, which is obviously sustainable led, but it's quite often in the bits of kit, you know, the strategies, how you're going to heat and ventilate the building. I think when it comes to materials like the plasterboard and the partitioning, I would say it's business as usual for most of our contractor clients. It's very difficult to get more sustainable products specified, partly, you know, lack of information, lack of knowledge of how to use them, install them, lack of supply quite often. You know, a lot of these sustainable products come from smaller manufacturers who are unlikely at this stage to be able to supply the need.
Afford the testing. Yeah. So Tim, you've done a lot of work. You work on small projects and you've particularly delved into how to use cork. What are your observations on using different types of materials, maybe different types of insulations?
Well, I think it's the challenge is that it's very difficult to prove their fire resistance. I mean, cork is actually quite good, but it hasn't had the testing so that you can to demonstrate it. And so, in the case where we did use it, we had to write a bespoke fire strategy and shoulder quite a lot of risk as a practice to take that on. So it is really difficult. And I think in general, you know, we're at the moment where we're getting 2 bits of legislation. And the pressure to massively reduce, the energy that buildings use and improve the sustainability, and at the same time, a much needed pressure on fire safety, and those are quite often in conflict, and it's difficult. It does feel like the 2 bits of legislation haven't been joined together, and we're just seeing Part O come in. And a great kind of increase in the requirements of Part L at the same time as and it's a real challenge. We've worked on bigger projects as well with bigger teams, and it's been a real struggle to achieve compliance on all fronts.
Jenny, you do loads of retrofit, I know, as well as new build. What are some of the challenges you've been up against?
Yeah, I think this is interesting. I think actually that there is a lot of compatibility between the sort of push for additional fire safety and the push towards net zero and carbon design, in that if you look through the Hackett report, the recommendations are very similar to the things that people have been saying for years are what are needed to get us towards a sort of more sustainable approach to buildings. I think the areas that there are sort of areas where we sort of part company in terms of challenge is partly in retrofit and also in the sort of questions around the circular economy and waste generation. With retrofit, you know, that's one of the things I think in terms of sustainability, you know, we're all starting to look at embodied carbon and reuse of buildings and things. But sort of going into buildings from a fire safety point of view is pushing us in the other direction, because quite often when we go into existing buildings, some quite recently rebuilt, which might be going through a slight repurpose, what one is uncovering is sort of failed intention of forms of procurement where work isn't up to the standard that it should be, or unwillingness to or a sort of change in the fire rating of a material, so that the scope becomes much bigger and much riskier, which is sort of pushing towards, well, just trash the whole thing and start again, which is sort of going in the other direction. I mean, the other thing I think is this, you know, we sort of Grenfell has initiated this re-look and reworking of some quite recently designed buildings, which, and I think Anna, we had a discussion quite recently about the sort of parallels between the sort of fire emergency and the climate emergency, and them being a fire, you know, that they're very similar, but just very different in terms of it's the scale, both of time and of space, in that a building is, the fire risk is an immediate contained risk, but the climate emergency is much bigger.
I'm going to stop you there, Jenny. Elaine, are you there? Can we hear you now?
I hope so. Can you hear me?
You're quite faint. I'm going to put you a question.
Okay.
So it's following on from what we were just saying. We live in a rapidly changing world with a rapidly deteriorating planet. How can we move specification to design in a more circular way so that buildings aren't so complicated to deconstruct? I mean, this applies just as much to concrete as it does to timber, as it does to steel, as to anything. What are you coming across in your research and your work?
Yeah, absolutely. And circular economy, of course, is a really significant way in which we can also reduce carbon. They are linked together. From a concrete point of view, clearly there's a lot of examples that have been talked about today, and where the longevity of that frame, we've got plenty of examples of where that non-combustible structure can be retained and everything else can be disassembled and extracted and removed from that building and then reapplied to improve its performance. Obviously, we've talked about some of the challenges there, making sure that it remains fire compliant. So, and of course, there is innovation starting to come through in the way of designing buildings to be and concrete structures to be designed to be disassembled. It's slightly more challenging to do that, but if the first instant actually is, you know, reuse that frame for as long as it can be, and often a concrete frame may be designed for 50 years, but it actually is built and designed without any additional requirements to last for 100 years. And that's what we should be doing right from the beginning, is using.
But all the other stuff we specify, all the facade components and everything else has to be able to be taken apart. I'm going to come to Tom, and I'm going to come to a question that you've raised, which is the whole insurance, building insurance question with regards to the move towards timber. You do a lot of work with Grosvenor and the Crown Estate and a lot of retrofit. What sort of issues are you running into?
Yeah, it's a very good point, and you're absolutely right. So whenever we have any timber involvement on a project, we're obviously pushing that for sustainability reasons. It becomes an issue for the building insurance, and so we end up having meetings where we have to explain the design over and over again to various loss adjusters and brokers, and often there's a pushback from those insurance companies, and they make premium estimates that are way beyond what a client is prepared to accept, and it makes it unaffordable to make a sustainable decision. Something we talked about in our pre-meeting was whether it's because the fact that going down a timber route is a choice versus a requirement, and if there was a bit more rigor around carbon and the kind of the embodied carbon in our projects, then actually it would be a much better equation, and we'd be able to make decisions for the right reasons instead of it being a a kind of risk-averse approach to anything innovative, because that's where insurance is, because of various events in the recent history that we all know about. Insurance companies don't want to be on the cutting edge of material choices, but in order to deal with the climate emergency, we probably all need to be pushing the boundaries to get to a kind of a world where we're not quite so carbon intensive and not wasting as much energy. So there's a real, yeah, it's been said before, there's a real conflict between these two things. And I don't think there needs to be a conflict, because I think actually things like timber are fire safe. There are lots of countries around the world building 13-story, huge, fully timber buildings. It's just in this country we seem to be a bit behind the curve on adopting and actually standing behind the various testing that has been kind of taken place and is in existence around the world.
One of the people I interviewed on my podcast is Dominique Gauzin-Muller, and she's based in Stuttgart, but she works a lot in France. And she talks how the whole building with straw has taken off in France. It's something like, I don't know, 6,000 buildings in the last decade. That may not be exactly the right number, but it's a phenomenal surge. And part of that was due to testing that has been made open source and available, so that not every project has to go on and reinvent the wheel and do its own testing, that certain standard solutions are accepted. Do you see is that a way forward, or do you see any of that happening anywhere? Who wants to take that? Anna.
Yeah, I think this is one of the big challenges, is that if someone funds a test and they're in a competitive environment, why on earth would they particularly want that test to be open source? But that means we've all got a massive problem in our industry if it isn't open source, because we've got a testing backlog and we can't move forward with all these, not just materials like straw, but across the board. We're stuck because we've got a number of situations where late on in a project, we might want to get something tested on site, but it's far too long. So I think the sustainability community has been incredibly forward thinking in the last few years about sharing so much of the research that they've done.
That's true.
And
yeah.
It's been such an amazing thing to see in the last 2 or 3 years, I think. Companies really putting aside their competitive advantages and all the rest of it, and producing software for each other, data for each other, et cetera, and I think it's just got to move into this arena too, so that we can actually move forward quickly.
Emily, yeah, what do you want to add to that?
I was just going to add to that. I think the insurance system needs to kind of catch up with that, to make sure that if you have funded a test, then it's okay to share that in a kind of, you're not taking on that additional liability, to make it in your interest to share it rather than actually making it harder, which seems to be happening at the moment. There's a lot of those blockers coming in. One thing I would just say is on the natural materials front, I think, yeah, there absolutely is a huge lack of data at the moment. But we're not finding, it's not as if moving to a more standardized kind of business as usual products actually solve it. Kind of internally at Archetype, just to help us get a sense of the issue, we've been looking at kind of hypothetical steel build-ups using much more standard products. And there's still a huge lack of testing there. So you're still finding that certificates from manufacturers are out of date, and therefore as designers, you're still being forced to take on some risk. So yeah, it's not as if shifting to that more standard construction actually solves all the issues either. And we're certainly finding that, it's scary, the scale of the issue, but that does kind of help us keep pushing on the lower embodied carbon materials, because it's not like there's not an easy solution for clients just saying, well, forget timber then, go for steel, because that still doesn't answer all the questions.
Right. Okay, we're going to pause there, and I'm going to come around to each of you to see what your top tip for moving this forward would be. And I'll take it in the reverse order this time. So Elaine, do you want to put something forward? We can't hear you. Oh dear, we can't hear you. Hello? I'll come back to you. Jenny, you're next.
I would say, as a top tip, something I was been quite heartened to hear mentioned a number of times this morning is the reinstatement of the clerk of works role in the way that they used to work. That real, I think, for both sustainability and fire safety, one of our concerns is actual performance in use. And clerk of works had this very specific monitoring role, which is much more detailed and hands-on than sort of site inspection, where site managers very often are preoccupied with sort of managerial positions, managing KPIs, movement of subcontractors and materials. And nothing really beats getting it right in construction and heading off problems at the pass.
Right. Okay, I'm going to stop you there. Roger, what?
I think for me, I think this is something that is coming, and I think it's one source of information. And I think the construction products index or information, I think, is being compiled at the moment, and it's a place where manufacturers will submit all their data. It will be compiled in a familiar format, and then you'll be able to compare and contrast between materials, and hopefully rely on it if you need to as evidence for compliance. So it's a single source of information would be great.
Yeah, because when we were speaking earlier in the week, there was a lot of talk about how every project is a bespoke solution. And so we need to move to more standardized ways of doing this, I guess, is what you're saying.
Well, I think for me, it starts with just individual components and products, but you're right, every project is bespoke, and at the moment we don't have data that relates to bespoke solutions. We have just data that relates to individual components and a few combination of those components. But as we said earlier, it's really difficult to get like a wall manufacturer, a partition manufacturer, to justify and give evidence of the testing data. And as soon as you swap out one product for another, it's almost impossible to prove that what we think is a relatively simple component actually performs as expected.
Right. Tim, I know you've talked a lot about ethics and sort of personal responsibility and risk in the profession. What's your top tip?
Well, I think that's important. I think everyone needs to take responsibility. I guess some of the early discussions today have been really interesting. That I think professionals generally are doing that and have reacted really well in general to Grenfell and the climate crisis, but that there needs to be a wider accountability to sort of contractors, suppliers, etc., on all of these things. That wasn't going to be my top tip. My top tip was going to be just earlier collaboration. One thing that and with people that you wouldn't normally cover at an early stage, and again, it was talked about earlier, you know, when we do concept designs for larger schemes, maybe not for like a house extension, but, you know, we'll get a fire engineer and building control, and, you know, maybe they won't be in the design team meeting, but we'll get 5 minutes with them to sort of say, like, does this work? Does this, and especially in things that I think sustainability is so crucial, get your structural engineer involved day one. You know, if you can reduce the structure, that's where so much of the carbon is. So, you know, I think it's just earlier collaboration, and of course it's so much easier now with things like Teams, like get everyone around the table early, and get all those things embedded from the
you know, this is absolutely crucial, and it is starting to happen. I mean, I've been writing about this subject of sustainability for 15 years, and you know, from the get-go, it was all about, you know, get the service engineers involved, get the structural engineers involved, get the landscape to the table early. Basically, we just need a much more integrated approach to all of these issues. Yeah. Okay, so Emily.
I'm worried I might be taking someone else's top tip for this, but I think it really is important. The legislate embodied carbon to really get
I'm sure Anna was going to nail that one.
Sorry, I'll let you pass this one. Just to really force the industry to invest in lower carbon materials and move away from the business as usual.
Right.
Sorry, Anna.
Okay. You can still come back on that one and give it a second plug if you want. Tom.
For me, I'm just going to go with as we're now a new international Britain, we ought to be able to accept testing from around the world and make ourselves truly international and begin to lead the field in sustainable materials. And if they are safe, obviously we need to verify the tests that have been done, but not stick rigidly to British standard testing, be a bit more flexible.
Yeah. Anna?
Actually, I will come at it from a slightly different angle. I think the legislating embodied carbon is also really important because we have to deal with all these issues at once. And I think one of the dangers, if you think about when we covered buildings with flammable insulation, it was in response to an issue and we weren't considering fire alongside that. So now we can't then lurch into considering fire at the expense of the climate emergency. So we have to legislate embodied carbon because we need to deal with the issues together.
Yeah, absolutely. I completely agree with you. Now, I'm going to take some questions from the chat, except I'm just disappeared. Wait a second. So this is a question from David Brook, who says, I've had to sign NDAs on engineering judgment for CLT fire stopping. And where did it go? It's unfortunate that it's so expensive and proprietary and so hence kept under wraps. We've touched on this a little bit, but who would like to comment?
I think we've had similar experience with other products. We've had to sign NDAs in order to release testing data. So it's not, this is out there, this is happening, So what do we do with that information? Are we allowed to inform our practice, our staff, that we've got some information, or is it just, do we have to keep it within the project team? It's quite a difficult position to be in. And we'd obviously love to share it with our peer architects as well, so we could all learn more, but quite often we're not allowed to.
I mean, this is also just a massive problem area in practice because CLT is obviously a bona fide way of getting sustainable building materials into new projects, and there is a massive lack of testing around fire stopping of services through CLT slabs. It's a real problem, and every conversation on those projects, you end up spending hours and hours and hours, and you have to accept some responsibility with your fire engineer around the solution. And it would be so much better for all of us if there was some amount of open source data out there that we all could rely on. Yeah.
So now I've got a question from Liam Ross. This is coming back to material choices again. High performance insulants are polymer or cellulose based and inherently combustible. This does seem to create a fundamental tension between fire safety and energy performance. Are safe homes cold and warm homes dangerous? Who wants to take a crack at that? Anna.
We don't need to use, we don't always need the walls to be as skinny as possible. We've got to just accept that there are other issues around here, and they're all a lot of them are petroleum based. And so I'm sure in a move towards the natural materials that we were talking about earlier, that Emily was just talking about, we have to look at all of the rounds, and we're going to have to address, we're going to have to achieve better U values with using natural materials anyway. So I think it's all very achievable.
Right. I want to come back to Jenny for a minute and the whole issue of, well, Jenny and or Tom, this whole issue of retrofit and some of the challenges you encounter there in terms of, you know, everything being bespoke, basically. And I know, Jenny, you've been working on some hospital projects healthcare where you've run into certain issues. Do you want to share some of that?
Yeah, I think, yes, again, I think it is that the specific thing about the industry. Generally, even a new build is quite bespoke, and in retrofit, you don't even have the option necessarily of reverting to any sort of standard manufacturer's details. Some of the things that we have found really helpful in sort of overcoming these things is really the client having the sort of foresight to put together the appropriate design team. So at the start of the project, all of the right consultants are in place with all of the right appointments, so that you have, as opposed to maybe having a fire engineer who's got a strategic role only, you have one who is prepared to get involved in the detail, to have contractors on board early who also are have the same degree of diligence in approach, and where that things can be actually shared around the team and looked at as quite specifically, so that any specific detail can be agreed by everybody to get to a point of reassurance.
Yeah, it's exactly that. If you've got a team that's been set up kind of wrong at the beginning with the fire engineer not fully engaged as a more strategic role, then yeah, it inevitably is problematic from everyone's perspective. But if you have an engaged fire engineer from the beginning, it is a lot simpler. In terms of like the sustainability side of it, it's the challenge that Emily mentioned as well, in that any kind of new material that's out there, and there are a few different plasterboard alternatives as well, they just haven't been tested for every type of scenario that you come across. So you end up not being able to really use them. And even with very committed fire engineers, without something to do some kind of desktop study, they're just not able to go with you as far as you might want to on the sustainability journey. And that's a problem we're not going to probably solve in the short term unless there is concerted effort to help those small suppliers of cutting edge innovative materials actually get tested, and that testing that we can all stand behind.
It's also a question of the engineers. I mean, when I first started writing about this, I spent all my time talking to service engineers. Now I spend most of my time talking to structural engineers, and they all say that in school they were taught to, do all the calculations for steel and concrete, but not for timber. And they need to upskill just as much as everybody else if we're going to push this debate forward. I see a lot of questions about timber in the chat, and I wanted to come back to something that you raised, Anna, when we were talking earlier in the week about encapsulation and how lean design, fewer materials, things that are easier to dismantle, all drives in favor of exposed finishes, and whereas this whole issue of timber and charring, et cetera, who wants to make some observations on that conflict and some ways forward with detailing CLT?
Well, I was just going to, it's not easy because we are having to encapsulate. And so, we were talking about this sort of sustainability being all about paring back, using less material, simpler junctions, fewer materials and all this. And, we're not just the encapsulation, both from the underside and also on top. It just is often with cementitious materials, it's moving really, really away from sustainability principles, that's for sure. But it is an absolute requirement now.
So Elaine, I'm sure you have I'll come back to you, Tom, next. Elaine, I'm sure you have something to say on this one. We can't hear you.
Oh,
You can put it in the chat. Put your observations in the chat.
I was just going to say that it's kind of a crazy situation, really, that you trying to do something that's lean, like Anna said, and is suitably pared back and as kind of crisp as it can be, and there are test data out there to show that you can use char rates and that it's thick enough to do the job that it needs to do for fire safety. But then you're being told, oh, I'm sorry, we're not going to accept that fire test result that's been done somewhere else, and you have to then clad it in something which is completely really not environmentally friendly and is not needed. So you're doubling up not only costs but also environmental impact of materials and labor, and it's a crazy situation, really.
I think someone put a really good comment in the chat about we have timber door sets that give you an hour fire rating and
Yes.
more, and that's a thin, 45mm thick door. Why isn't CLT treated? It should be. CLT clearly would perform better than that.
Tim, did you want to say something? Yeah.
Yeah, I was just going to come back to the plasterboard thing, because I found a amazing statistic that they thought that plasterboard was responsible for 3.5% of the entire emissions of the UK in 2017. And when on the scale that we work on, all of the solutions are plasterboard based. So it's like, if you want to get a 1 hour wall, 2 loads of plasterboard. If you want to get if you need to make the steel fire resistant, 2 bits of plasterboard or 1 bit of fireboard. And so the whole basis of the way that we kind of deal with it, especially at a smaller scale, is on this product that is in one of the highest, got one of the highest carbon footprints imaginable. And as I think Tom was saying, like, the alternatives just haven't been tested. They do exist, but again, it's this thing about this conflict of, we're trying to change the way we think about buildings and the way that we kind of approach these solutions, at the same time as kind of resolving as tightening up the fire regulations. And these are still areas where they kind of come into conflict.
Yeah, there are a number of comments in the chat here. One saying on CL, this is from David Brook. Yeah, on CLT burning, you can reference Eurocode or manufacturer char rates, even though it's a little complex, but most likely suitable for low-rise and mid-rise and non-sleeping accommodation without encapsulation.
But even we're getting pushback on that now from building control and fire engineers. It's not, unfortunately, they're not accepting it fully anymore. They were a couple of years ago, but even on commercial office buildings, which like non-sleeping risks, relatively low rise, it's there's some pushback.
Emily, what about on schools and the work you've been doing in Scotland?
Same as Tom. So we're finding more and more in the last 18 months, 2 years, we're getting pushback on all of this. Even if it kind of explicitly says in a British standard it's okay to use it, there's a lot of nervousness around in not doing encapsulation. I mean, I think it really feels like, to me, like we need to be moving away from this kind of current approach of 3 meter by 3 meter furnace testing for build-ups, because getting all the build-ups we need to tested, as Anna touched on earlier, we're just never going to be able to do this at the scale we need to. Even like, silly things like the biggest test rig in the UK is 3 meters tall, and you can extrapolate from that with a desktop assessment a little bit in accordance with the BS if you find a good kind of dedicated fire engineer happy to do it, but nothing like enough. Which, like, does that literally mean in the UK we can only be designing flat roof bungalows? It's just completely bizarre. And so I think it feels like we really need a kind of strong steer on how the industry should be dealing with this issue, so that we can develop a kind of standardized approach rather than kind of ad hoc practice to practice.
Jenny?
I'm listening with great interest, because we haven't. We have recently had a school that is a CLT building that has just come through planning, but we haven't reached the next stage. So I'm listening with great interest to the challenges you guys have faced so far.
One of the issues that came up this morning is actually bringing some of this review process on fire concerns early, back into the planning process, and the lack of skills, which is something often talked about in terms of sustainability, but equally in terms of fire. Someone who may have a geography degree, how are they going to be reviewing these very technical subjects, and what sort of interface is there with building control and getting the appropriate technical support? I mean, it's all about the interface between the different actors in the process and good collaboration. I don't know if any of you have any experience or observations on that, or if it's too early days.
I mean, I think that links to kind of maintaining the golden thread of information. Who are we receiving information from? What expertise do they have? How are we recording those decisions? Who's taking responsibility for it? Yeah, It's a big issue.
I think that also touches on the issue of insurance that I know we have all had problems with before. Both building insurance and PI insurance is about we've had things come back to us without that the insurers are not able to define. So that some things need to be done for asset protection, or what is a wall build-up, what is cladding, what is the facade, what are each of these elements, but they've never been able to sort of go further into, well, what do you mean by that? What is the technical consequence? So I wonder if that has an impact on where other consultants start pulling back from things that they might have offered before, in that, we're sort of sitting in this complex array around obtaining PI insurance for our work, and different regimes for different aspects of it.
Well, this whole issue of PI insurance, I know that there's been a lot of work done on that through the Timber Accelerator at the Association for Sustainable Building Products, and a lot of people are looking at that now. But share some of your experience, because I think you were saying that it's so exorbitant that you have to pass it on to a client, and then it can even put you out of the running in terms of being competitive on certain jobs. Who wants to comment on that?
I mean, I can give some examples of kind of previous scenarios we've been looking at to get. So we've kind of developed an in-house kind of workflow. So ideally, we're using a build-up that's already got certification. If it doesn't, but we're close to it, you can get a desktop assessment, but they're 5K-ish a go. If you don't have that and you need to do certification, then we're looking at like 15K easily. And that's huge if you think of the number of build-ups you might have in a large project. Because remember, for each of those, you have to meet the build-up exactly. So if you're talking timber frame, some areas you have 140 studs, but around a 2-story sports hall, you need 200 studs. That's 2 separate fire tests. It's huge.
Right. I think it's really interesting because in terms of sustainability, for so long, the conversation has been about thermal performance. Now it's about embodied carbon. But when you get into this, it's really about the detailing and the buildup of, how do you do the detailing? So, it goes through everything. We know that. Let's see. We've talked, do you want to talk a little bit more about specific, actually, there was one good question here I wanted to bring out. This is from Kathy Lee. Oops, my chat keeps moving once I get it to where I think it should be. Every time a new question comes in, the question I'm looking at moves up. Does anyone have any, this is from Kathy Lee, does anyone have any knowledge relating to issues about low temperature ignition of timber? There are incidents where this has happened. Fire tests are usually done at high temperatures. And I'm curious because of the potential risk in timber frame airtight constructions and the wood drying out over time. And while we talk about 30-minute, 1-hour fire ratings, the effects on, well, yeah. Does anyone have any observations on that? Low temperature ignition of timber or experience with that? As all the testing is really done at high temperatures.
Not any specific experience with that, but again, all I'd say is the fire tests are done in very, very specific furnace scenarios, which don't reflect a real fire, and it's another limitation of furnace tests. But it's kind of the best we've got at the moment.
Okay, so we're coming to the end of our session, but there's one really sort of overarching issue that I wanted to pull out and get your thoughts on, which is, you know, fire is so immediate, and it just is a flashpoint that focuses everyone's attention on the immediate urgency of addressing this, whereas climate change is equally urgent, but it's a much longer time horizon, and it seems to always take the back seat when coming to this kind of decision making on a project. How do we change that? I mean, is that back to the top tips, or who wants to say something on that? Elaine? Chat? Look at the chat. Look at the chat. Okay, I'll look at the chat. Who wants to say something?
So, because I think this is what we were talking about when we met earlier. But I mean, if you think about the risk profile of climate change versus risk profile of someone dying in a building, you know, climate change is far, far, far more deadly. It's far more deadly now, and it's far more deadly in the future. But it's sort of how we perceive that risk, and I suppose the fact that the impact might not be local to ourselves or might not be immediate. But I suppose the insurance industry, and we're all talking about this instant response to a situation which is totally understandable and justifiable, but how on earth we communicate the deadliness of climate change in the same way that we understand it in relation to the burning of buildings is I don't have an answer to that, but I think that's the challenge, isn't it?
Yeah, I think we're moving into a world where our context is really changed. You know, we are talking about the changes due to fire safety at the moment, but climate change is going to be an ongoing change. It's not going to change a bit and then stop. So that's something we're going to need to look at. We're going to need to look at different ways of doing things, potentially making buildings more demountable so that they are easier to retrofit as unforeseen changes hit us. I was struck by something that I think Peter Wilkinson said earlier on today, where he said the problem is that doing things properly costs money. And I think we've sort of...
Jane was saying that too.
You know, we've reached the point where actually we can't afford cheap and nasty anymore, and we can't afford to wait until it becomes the solution. We've seen what's happened on the fire issue with cheap and nasty. So I think we just, the construction industry does need to mobilize, and we need to all become team players in something that really puts this front and center, and you know, absorbs both the fire safety issues, the climate change issues, and leaves room for the further unforeseens that we might be facing.
I was just going to also add to that, and I think I talked a bit about these things being in conflict, but I think actually they're both about the same thing, which is, you know, to have thoughtfully and competently designed buildings that are diligently and carefully constructed. And so I think it all comes back to good, you know, having a rigorous process. And it's a, you know, it's a lot is changing, and we're all having to adapt to that. But I think fundamentally it's about designing good buildings that are safe, but and respond to the climate emergency.
Yeah, well, I guess that's what Elaine has put here in the chat as well. It's not an either or. We need to do both, and we can do both without, well, seems like we often can address fire safety without addressing sustainability. That's the problem. So without the legislation, it's just not, it's not going to move forward. And there is one comment here in the chat that I think is a sort of hopeful and positive note to end on. And if any of you would like to comment, please do. So this is from Marta Zatwornika. There is no progress without innovation. So how do we support innovation within our industry? Or examples of something exciting that gives you hope that you've seen in this sector. Anybody? Roger?
Well, I think there are lots of experts out there, lots of very intelligent people doing very clever things. I think we just need to pick up on those things that we think have got longevity and answer all the questions.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Anyone else want to have a final word? Well, I think we can wrap it up there. I mean, we've hit on a lot of issues. I think the need to get more open source testing and to legislate embodied carbon, these two things would really push the dial forward. And I really thank you for all your inputs. Anybody else want to have one final word?
I think John joined up thinking from legislators that brings together the kind of challenges of fire safety and sustainability would be great.
And I think that's a real opportunity for architects, because I think within the construction industry, if anything, we are the joined up thinkers. We are the people, we are masters of none in some sense. We have all these wonderful other very skilled people to call on. And part of what being an architect is about systems thinking and being comfortable with it and bringing things together. So I think it is an opportunity for architects to skills
and be able to lead the team, lead that collaboration and oil the or facilitate the interplay between the disciplines, which too often remain in silos. I mean, these are things we've been talking about for a long time, but it is changing. And certainly listening to the sessions this morning, there is a lot of guidance coming through now in this area. So it's a question of, how is that going to play out? And I'm not totally convinced that the net zero agenda is being fully, pushed quite as hard as it should be in terms of the targets we need to be meeting. Okay, well, I think I will thank you all very much for joining this session, for your thoughts, for your input today. And I think it was a really interesting session, and we just have to see how we can keep on plugging and keep on pushing for these various changes, really industry-wide changes that we need. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Hattie.
Hi.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye.
Thanks for everyone who joined.